Welcome to COVID and Climate Change Correlations, a weekly video podcast where I, Daniel Sanderson, engage in a stimulating conversation with post-Keynesian economist Steve Keen. Okay, welcome everybody. We're back in virtual studio with Professor Steve Keen, and we have a special guest, Andrew Norris, who has joined us today. But before I get to Andrew, I want to spend a little bit of time with Steve on a summary of the timeline of his book. So today's questions from Andrew are in particular to the Debunking Economics book that Steve originally wrote in 2001, and I hope he gets this particular reference. But Steve, when did you get into the dethroning of emperors? When did that happen and come about?
Well, I mean, it fundamentally began in 1971 because I was an undergraduate student at Sydney University, and this is the middle of the Vietnam War period, of course, when Australia, as it always does, stupidly decided to join America in one of its invasions. And was facing conscription. And it was also a time of very high employment, so nobody's worried about not getting a job. Well-funded universities. And in the middle of all that, with all the political foment in the background, I was learning mathematics while I was also doing economics. And one of my lecturers pointed out the theory of the second best, which basically undermines everything in standard neoclassical micro. It's not the sort of thing you normally learn in first year. You normally learn about it in master's preparation and PhD, by which time you've swallowed the neoclassical Kool-Aid and you accept it all. Well, I didn't. And then from 71 on, I was leading a student revolt at Sydney University against the teaching of neoclassical economics. So it goes way back to then. But in terms of writing the book, the motivation for that came about in 1999, I think, when actually for a short while I was a school teacher. And a guy that I taught at school became editor of Pluto Press in Australia. And he said that he got in touch with the first, I want to publish the Steve Keen book, so what have you got for me? And at the time I was working on a set of leaflets, which were called Debunking Economic Rationalism, which is the term Australians used for it, for a community group that went nowhere. And he said, oh, that sounds great. Knock off the rationalism. That won't sell overseas, and make it into a book. And that's what was the motivation. So I began working on the book in 1999, I think, wrote most of it in 2000, and it was published in 2001.
Right on. Well, how did the slight change in title come with the 10-year anniversary? We went from the emperor of the social sciences to dethroning of the emperor. So there's something happened with that expanded edition, and was there something in the nuance of that emperor reference that?
Well, we start with the naked emperor. Obviously, that was the naked emperor of the social sciences. Yeah, and that's actually a term which a good friend of mine, Alan Kerman, first used in a paper talking about the impact, what's called the Sonnenschein-Mantel-Debreu theorem, on neoclassical micro, and so I thought that was a good subtitle, so I stole it, which Alan forgave me for later, or actually applauded me for. And then because between 2001 and 2011, you had the financial crisis in 2008. And that was something which I started warning about as of December 2005, and saying, it was inevitable, be global in scale, et cetera, et cetera. And so after all that was sort of done and dusted, it was time to revise the book, and that was the obvious thing to say, that it should have been dethroned, because neoclassicals were the ones coming out in 2007 saying what a fabulous year 2008 was going to be. And I quoted them extensively in the book, of course. And of course, that should have been the end of them, but they survived virtually anything. They survived the Great Depression with their belief system intact. They survived the financial crisis, but they should have survived neither.
Well, and isn't that one of the main points, or the thesis of the book, and really effectively what Minsky's point is, that you've kind of been running the torch with, is that they didn't take into accommodation the Great Depression, and therefore, it's like a hyper-rationalized economic model that, what gives them the right to take this sort of description of economics if they can't take into account these kind of catastrophes?
Yeah, well, that was exactly Minsky's point, as you say. Minsky said that he wrote very well in small dashes. He didn't write all that well in large publications. But in the preface for his collected essays called Finance and Economic Breakdown, or Can It Happen Again, depending on the country it's sold again, he said the most important event of the post-war period is something that has not happened. We have not had a severe and long-lasting economic downturn, a depression. And he said, the interesting question is why? And he said, to answer that question, you have to have a model in which those sorts of events are possible. Now, what neoclassicals have done, and you can see it in all their literature as well, is they say, oh, that's an exception. Let's leave that out, Well, if you leave it out, what you're describing is effectively, you're using, I think this is a very apt analogy, you're using a model of a drag racer as your ideal car, and you refuse to explain why drag racers are crashing on all the corners, on all the roads in America. Let's just assume they're all straight, therefore crashes can't occur, and all those crashes are exogenous events. And fundamentally, they would never admit to thinking that way, but that's fundamentally how they do think.
Oh, I love that, Steve, because I'm going to be looking for drag racing clips. You know that, right?
Go for it.
Okay, Andrew, let's bring you into the conversation here, Andrew. And remember, the questions, let's just keep them, open and fluid. And, there's going to be plenty of time for the three of us to talk about each one. So why don't you, just, fire away, Andrew?
Yeah, I actually had a question to bounce off the Great Depression model that Minsky had. So the Great Depression is one of those things that you should model. And I was wondering if a total war situation, because that is also a very unique economic situation, should also be something that should be factored into these economic models. Oh,
yeah. And in fact, that is fundamentally, in some ways, how modern monetary theory came about. Because the Great Depression obviously was a huge disturbance to how mainstream economists thought about government spending, because the previous, if you read Calvin Coolidge, his 1928 State of the Union address said how wonderful it was that he'd run a 1% of GDP surplus for the previous 8 years, each of the previous 8 years, and how this was the foundation of prosperity, and bang, the Great Depression hits. Now, when the Second World War hit, you had both America and the UK on occasions having budget deficits of 30% of GDP. And rather than that being where can you find 30% of GDP? Simple, you create it. That's what the deficits did, and that's and that's how the war was financed. And the same thing actually applied with Hitler, amusingly enough. And the reason that he was using exactly the same strategy to build Germany up after the Second World War, after the Great Depression, and one reason why he was so popular in Germany was he fundamentally followed the advice he got from one Henry Ford. And as well as being an anti-Semite of the first order, Henry Ford was also somebody who understood money creation. And I had this pointed out to him by somebody who read my book and said, why don't you thank your predecessors, and mentioning Henry Ford as one of them. And I wasn't aware of this, but in the dedication, the first edition to Mein Kampf, the only person who gets a dedication is Henry Ford. That's a long embellishment, but fundamentally governments create money when they spend. So if you have something like an existential threat like a war, and you want to direct as much as the economy's productive capacity as possible to building armaments, then you want the state needs to buy the output of private factories, and it does it simply by running the deficit itself. And then the war bonds which are sold don't create, they don't, the war bonds themselves, when they're sold to the banks, don't create any money. They simply convert the excess reserves created by the deficit into income earning bonds for the banks. but yeah, fundamentally, you have to explain how the Second World War was financed, and the only answer is the government created the money to finance the war, and then of course when you do that, you get full employment, and in fact, so full employment, of course, we had Rosie the Riveter in the factories, women in other words, making the goods while the men were off in the war, in the Army and the Navy and the Air Force. And that was an enormous mobilization brought about by the capacity of the state to create money.
Isn't that kind of how we're in the situation right now, though? Because the reason that we had such growth over those years is we had 4% debt growth, which is why we had 4% GDP growth. But now that we can't seem to get that debt going again, so it seems like it's a good thing until it kind of crashes, and then
you're thinking of government spending? You're thinking of government spending or private debt?
Well, I was talking about private debt in that situation, but I mean both of them are the creation of money, right?
Yeah. Oh well, they both the private. Banks create money by lending back more than they get back in repayments, and governments create money by spending more than they take back in taxes. That's in a nutshell. That's the two ways of creating money. The problem for the private sector, when you borrow money and you cause a boom, and the real example there is the 1920s. You had private sector debt going from, I haven't got the figures in front of me, but it was something of the order of, say, 35% to 90% of GDP over the 1920s. And that caused an absolute boom, of course. And a large part of that borrowing was to, in fact, borrow to speculate on shares. So margin debt as a percentage of GDP went from 1% of GDP in 1921 to 12%. Actually, when I adjusted for more recent figures, effectively 13% of GDP in 1929, and then back down to 1% and 0.5%. So that was the boom and bust of the 1920s, leading to the bust of the 1930s. So that's the real dilemma. But the government sector, so long as and this is where I differ from modern monetary theory, so long as you're running a balance of trade surplus, or you have such a big economy you don't need to worry about it, which is the American case in some ways, the government can run whatever deficit it wishes to. And then when it finances it, it's not actually borrowing money. It's created the money. You don't need to borrow if you can create money, fundamentally. It's in the consequences of what you do with that creation of money that matters, rather than whether you can or can't do it. So with the government, what that meant was America ended up with the Second World War with a government debt level of 110% of GDP, having started with about 30%. But that was easily reduced because you had such high economic activity in the 1950s and 60s that the debt level rose even while the government was still running deficits. The debt ratio fell even though the government was still predominantly running deficits in the 50s and 60s. So that's why I'm very strict about saying you've got to separate private debt from public debt, because private debt is a debt. Public debt is fundamentally a record of government money creation.
Okay, interesting. So I have a question to bounce off that, but I'm just trying to think of how to word it. So there's got to be a limit to how much money creation they can do, right? And how should that limit be bound? Well,
I mean, what I think is that when you look at the level of money creation, it's really the amount of economic activity you generate out of that matters. Because if you simply think like in strict money turnover terms, then the debt ratio is the accumulated money divided by the rate at which money turns over times the amount of money. Okay? So, okay, you want that to be a reasonably good ratio and a fairly large rate of turnover. If what you do ends up causing a decline in the turnover of money, whether that's private created or government money, then your economy's got a problem. And that's where we've got ourselves into, because we've obsessed about the government debt level, and that's been the neoclassicals, that's their sole obsession. Or not their sole, they've got inflation's another one, obviously. But that's their monetary obsession is the level of government debt. Now, what that's meant is we have two ways of creating money, government or private. We've flipped far too much of that into the private sector. So banks have created most of the money for the last 30 or 40 years. And that's then been the accumulation of private debt. And one thing which we all do when we have private debt is, if we're carrying a lot of private debt, we try to save to make sure we can cover that, service that debt. And what we mean by saving is spending more slowly. So what you get out of it is a decline in GDP. Okay, your turnover of money drops because of your increase in the level of private debt. And that, I think, plays a major role in explaining why we've had such sluggish economies, because we've obsessed about government debt and ignored private.
Yeah, and I love the fact that you do focus on private debt, because it's pretty rare. I think it's you, Fox Bay, maybe one or two others. Obviously, other people you reference in your book, Irving Fisher, I'm starting to grow a appreciation for. But yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, you've got to include. I mean, it's leaving out credit. What they fundamentally do is leave credit out of their economic thinking. And look, I understand the logic behind why they do it. I also know why the logic is wrong in a monetary economy. But if you're leaving out credit, you're leaving a very large and highly volatile component of what causes the economy to go forwards or backwards. And then you're trying to explain it on the remainder. And Keynes didn't get this right, by the way. Keynes of the general theory didn't. Keynes of the treatise on money was closer. But he talked at one stage in the general theory of what he called the causa causans, the primary cause, and was locating investment as a primary cause of volatility in the economy. But behind that, again, it tends to be credit itself, which is the main cause of the fluctuations in investment. So if you're leaving credit out of your thinking, you're leaving out the most volatile part of the economy and then trying to explain it. Well, good luck.
Mm-hmm. So is there... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask something, Steve, that you seem to make a distinction between your position on modern monetary policy, and if I understood it correctly, you differ from a modern monetary policy because you focus on the economic turnover in addition to that overemphasis on inflation. Is that correct?
No, the one strong difference I have with the modern monetary theory group is something that they have a different explanation for. So their explanation about government spending is to say that governments don't tax to spend; they spend and then tax afterwards, which is, in the accounting sense of what I do with my Minsky software, that's exactly what I confirm. But they have a totally different explanation of foreign trade, and they say exports are a cost and imports are a benefit. And this is another thing from Warren Mosler, out of his what he calls 7 deadly frauds, I think it is, or seven innocent frauds, whatever the book is called. Therefore, a trade surplus is a bad thing. He actually thinks you're better off getting a deficit because you send pieces of paper overseas and you get goods back. And I think that's nonsense for a whole range of reasons. I don't make a big song and dance about it because modern monetary theory has been very successful in getting a non-orthodox way of thinking about the economy into the public arena, and I have no intention of derailing them from that. But particularly when coronavirus hit, one obvious thing about COVID was it completely screwed global trade, and in that situation, with the situation where in terms of like how much debt can you carry, it's countries that have a trade surplus that have a huge buffer on that front. So Japan, for example. I think Japan's government debt level now about 240% of GDP, and it's not blinking at that level because its debt's owed to other Japanese, and the main holder of Japanese debt is the Japanese central bank. Now, of course, if you're running a trade deficit and you therefore have to convert your currency into a foreign currency to buy overseas goods all the time, then some of those bonds are going to be sold internationally. And if you get to the point that your currency is seen as exposed, then you can have a currency crash, which because the foreign the foreign buyers won't accept debt denominated in your currency. They'll want it in a foreign currency. And then you've got to earn the trade surplus to be able to pay the interest on that. And you end up in an Argentina type situation. So I differ on that particular front. And like in terms of modern monetary theory's scope, modern monetary theory is very much about the monetary system. It talks about the real system by saying the level of monetary demand can cause excess demand causing inflation, which is the main break they see in what the monetary sector can do. But they don't have a sophisticated theory of the physical economy as yet, though they can easily be married to a post-Keynesian view of how the physical economy operates. So yeah, I mean, I've got my criticism, but generally speaking, whatever hat I have, I'll take off to them because they've managed to make non-orthodox economic theory part of public discourse, and that's something nobody's done since Keynes.
I love that explanation, Steve. It's like we'll pick our battles, we'll allow it to mature, and then work with the group. And I know you've got a friendly relationship, with some of the leaders in that. Stephanie Kelton, for example. I know you're very you're friends with Stephanie, and so I mean, yeah, that's a very good explanation. Andrew, go ahead. You had another question.
Yeah, so I'm very against private debt. Well, I'm kind of against debt altogether, but I still don't fully understand the public debt thing that you've kind of described. So I need to mull that over more. But on the private debt sector side, I really like the flow chart model that you had of how bankers get money to firms for investment and how that all balances out. I was wondering if debt is necessary within that system, or if you could just take care of that through private investment, and therefore making it so that you don't have this kind of non-risk, usurious system of debt, which I'm personally not a fan of.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've got to have fundamentally assets-backed liabilities in that sense, and money is a liability of the banking sector. There has to be an asset on the other side, and that asset primarily is debt. Now, when you look at the government's position, the government's the same sort of assets and liabilities thing in a monetary way, but the fundamental asset of a government is the economy itself, the nation. So its backing is independent in that sense of whether it's issuing debt or not. It could create the money and just run up a overdraft at the central bank, and nobody would be any the wiser, because the central bank is owned by the Treasury, which is part of the government. So in that sense, you can say that in a way, government money is non-debt-based money, whereas the private sector, because banks take a debt position when they lend, then it's debt-based money. Now, you could imagine a banking system that took equity positions. So when a bank made a loan, rather than getting a charge, here's $1 million, you owe us $1 million, and here's the interest rate. You could say, here's $1 million, that gives us 50% equity, and we want half your dividend flow. So you could imagine a banking sector that had equity rather than debt backing it up. But what we have, of course, is a monetary system based on debt alone. And if you wanted to have more of a debt-free system at the moment, given what we have with private banks that create money by creating debt and the government that creates money by running a deficit, what you'd want is to have more government-created money. And then in terms of the investment side of things, you would then have people taking at equity positions by using the government-created money they had to provide share capital to firms that wish to invest. But you'd need a lot more government-created money to make that feasible.
Yeah, I'm definitely okay. I'd rather have that than our current situation, for sure.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, because debt end up being a form of modern slavery in many ways. And when you let the banks create as much debt as they like, I mean, the classic is the housing bubble, for example. The debt itself creates the housing bubble. And what you have is people borrowing money to buy into a housing market, which has been driven up by the leverage. And then you get this, indefinite cycle up to a crash point, which is what was happening back in 2005 to 2007. And that is just an illicit way to to create money, and the banks are rewarded for bad behaviour. Whereas, of course, if they took an equity position, then when the housing market crashed, so were the assets of the banks, and you would have, in that sense, more responsible, not lending, but money creation, if the banks were going to take it on the nose in equity. Whereas with debt, they don't. They, if the borrower goes under, then the bank gets the assets that have been, financed by the debt, and it's the borrower who takes the opprobrium, not the money creator.
I like this a lot. What was I going to say? No, go ahead. Sorry.
I have something to add on that. Would you not have as much speculative run-up on housing, for example, to talk about that particular industry? So the housing bubble, if you didn't have the borrowing and the debt and that speculative sort of buyer, or in the housing market, would prices stay more affixed to where the valuation is?
They'd be much lower. I mean, you wouldn't have a housing bubble at all, quite probably. Because if what actually drives, and this is why when you understand that banks create money by lending, then you have to say, what is that money being used to finance? And if that money was going into corporations, which is the sort of vision that Schumpeter has back in the theory of economic development back in the 1930s, that banks are effectively providing venture capital. If they were doing that, that'd be fine. But in fact, the easiest way to create money for a bank is to lend into a housing bubble, because you create the money, you get a new mortgage. The demand for housing is fundamentally new mortgages. So the price level is set by new mortgages, and therefore change in the price level is set by change in the level of new mortgages. So what you have is, while debt is accelerating, you get rising house prices. Of course, nothing accelerates forever. So when you hit the acceleration stops, the plunge begins. And if you take a look at the American data, that plunge began in 2006. So the actual housing bubble was a creation of the credit system, and so was its breakdown. And that is it's an insane reason to create money to cause a speculative bubble. But the same thing in the 1920s, as I said, mortgage debt went from 1% to 13% of GDP over the 1921 to 29. That gave us the Great Depression. So you simply don't want to allow, because you can't trust banks to lend responsibly, you have to constrain what they can lend for, which we don't do. So I would abolish margin loan completely. Okay, if you want to speculate in the stock market, do it with your own money. And I'd also put limits on mortgage lending so that you couldn't lend more than 10 times the rental, actual or imputed rental income of a property to the buyer of the property. So no matter how wealthy you were, if a place was earning $1 million in rent per year, you couldn't borrow more than 10 million to buy it. So we need to break the link between money creation and asset price bubbles. And the easiest way would be laws like that, but another system, of course, would be changing, making banks take an equity position rather than a debt position.
Interesting. So it doesn't mean that the ultra rich couldn't still own, fantastically big, say private residences, but they'd be financing it on their, from their own existing capital, right?
Yeah. I mean, housing shouldn't be an asset class. Housing is fundamentally a human need. Shares are clearly an asset class, but if you look at the extent to which the value of shares is driven by margin debt, and margin debt again by the value of shares, you get this positive feedback between the two. Again, it's overwhelming. So because we don't understand how money is created, we've allowed banks to create money for asset bubbles. And that's the last thing capitalism needs.
Right. I see that there's an aspect of this bubble and these where people can actually buy houses, and you have an upward mobility in a middle class or a lower middle class. A lot of people have their retirements put into their homes because it is treated as an asset, and so. I mean, I at least, my parents were like that, right?
Yeah, well, as long as they're relying upon the rental income, that's fine. I mean, my wife is always bugging me about buying properties over here so we earn a rental income. That'd be fine. It's when you try to make rising prices over time, and that inevitably leads to the sort of situation we can see in Australia right now, for example, my old home country, where the prices have got so high that people, your average first-home buyer is in their 40s. If you keep on doing it, average home buyer in their 50s, then their 60s. It's crazy to build an economy on that basis, but that's what we've ended up doing by letting banks create money, whatever they damn well like, as if they've got the right to do that when they wouldn't be a bank in the first place without being given a banking license, which is a legal entitlement by the government of that country. And that legal entitlement should come with limits on what you can do with it. In that sense, our treatment of constraints on banks is a bit like American gun laws. You can blast somebody's head off so long as, it's your democratic right to go and shoot somebody else. Almost seems to be the American treatment of guns. We've let the banks do the same thing.
Andrew, do you want to comment on guns, or do you want to move on to another question? We've got the American
so,
okay?
Yeah, no, I mean, I do kind of understand that perspective of people. This is one of the things that kind of drives me nuts about libertarians and stuff like that too, where they'll groups but businesses and stuff like that will be given protections by the government, and then they find it offensive that the government will have certain expectations of that group for the privileges that they're given. So I think that's a really nice way to summarize that. I did have something. So with banks, if we had asset-backed loans where they would have an equity position in the company that they gave a loan to, would they still be able to androgynously create money?
Yeah, absolutely. It's just an operator. This is why thinking in terms of assets and liabilities is essential to understanding how banks operate, because money is a liability to the banking sector. So when they create money, the liabilities rise. For them to be able to do that, their assets have to rise as well. That asset could be debt or it could be equity.
Okay. How, because the cycle of money would look a little different in this system, right? Because right now, money gets created as debt, that cycles through the economy, and then it's removed from the system when it's paid off. With this asset-backed version, when it's paid off, the company would get basically be buying the equity from the bank back. Is that how that would work?
It'd be actually a legitimate form of share buyback, yeah. Very
cool. This is not something I had thought of before, and I really like it.
Good. Yeah, I mean, I've proposed we have to change how the share. I mean, we have to. I mean, you use. I know it's not going to happen. I'm putting forward ideas that I'm almost certain will never be implemented. But one is what I call Jubilee shares as well, because we obsess about the stock market as being the price discovery system, and you get all these crazy asset bubbles coming out because it's fundamentally being driven by margin debt leverage and so on, and also QE. But the real thing you want the share market to do is to get money to entrepreneurs. And I've got generally speaking, a very close family. And one of my very earnest brothers-in-laws was explaining to me how he and his wife had decided to buy shares in an Australian company called Cochlear that you might be aware of, which is one of the world's leading producers of hearing aids, because they thought they really liked what Cochlear was doing. And I didn't have the heart to tell them when they were buying those shares, they were buying them off a speculator on the stock market, and the money they spent buying the shares didn't go anywhere near Cochlear itself. So we treat the stock market as if it's mainly a raiser of initial equity capital for corporations, and it's anything but. So we need to make it like that. So what I propose would be what I call Jubilee shares, and that when a share is first issued, if it's bought by somebody and they hold on to it, then it continues to receive dividends and so on. Allow a number of sales, a bit of price discovery, maybe say 10 sales, but after the 10th sale, it converts from being a permanent share into a 50-year bond. And then you get a chance for price discovery for a while, but ultimately its value is going to drop to zero. So, all back to the original issue price. So you change the focus from the secondary market to the primary market. And then the share market might do something useful. But at the moment, It's just another source of another casino running capitalism.
Wow, that's incredible. And then, but along with that comes the realization that, that's really hard to. I think in 30 seconds or less, Steve has said we want to upset Wall Street and all of the major banks. So we have our work cut out for us after we leave this call here, right, Steve?
It's not going to happen. I mean, the only way this would only happen if it had a complete change in the governance of capitalism, and that's the people who fight tooth and nail against it would be the finance sector fundamentally. I mean, some entrepreneurs would probably like it. But it's the strength of the finance sector that is stopping this happening. So the wolves on Wall Street would not appreciate these ideas, and the wolves are the ones who run capitalism, not the actual entrepreneurs and capitalists themselves.
That's a very good explanation, because I get into this conversation with other philosophers about Marxist economies and this dichotomy between socialist economies and capitalist economies. And I'm an entrepreneur myself, and I'm not, I don't feel like I fall into that financial sector. I feel the pinch just like anybody else. And yet, I don't want to be lumped into this category of the capitalist, right?
Well, in that sense, I'm an entrepreneur as well. I've designed 2 computer software packages. I've worked in the private sector for some time before I became an academic. So, and I really appreciate entrepreneurial personalities and entrepreneurial organizations. I don't appreciate finance. And, but we've let finance dominate capitalism. And as Marx himself said, he called them the roving cavaliers of credit. So it's a wonderful put down. And he said, this gang knows nothing about production and should have nothing to do with it. But occasionally, circumstances conspire to let them take over the system. And he's dead right. Finance should be the servant of entrepreneurial capitalism, not the master.
Yeah. Andrew, how's your question list looking?
It's looking good. I keep coming up with new ones as we talk here. So, so what you kind of just mentioned that it wasn't going to change, but isn't there room for let's say I started a bank, couldn't I set it up to basically be an asset-backed loan bank? And couldn't we set up like a stock market that effectively worked in a Jubilee share system and just kind of create a side institution and try to basically outcompete them?
Yeah, that's possible. I mean, for example, one of the fastest growing parts of the world, I haven't kept track of them in great detail, but it's a part of Spain called the Mondragon region. Have you heard of that?
I have not.
Okay. I'll just make sure I've spelled the word properly. I'll just actually find it for you. Mondragon. So I think Mondragon, Mondragon Corporation. And that was started by, I think, a Jesuit priest in Spain who realized how depressed this particular region was and that they couldn't get investment. And he persuaded I think a corporation was being shut down. He persuaded the workers to take it over and form a workers' cooperative with share issuance and so on. And it's been extremely successful. It has been the fastest growing part of the capitalist economy for about 40 or 50 years. So it's quite a remarkable case of that being done successfully. But it's, it began in 1956 and you haven't heard of it, which implies it hasn't taken over capitalism. So it's feasible, but the amount of money that if you've got the capacity to create money, which the financial sector has, as easily as it can through banking, then the power that gives them is enormous compared to something dedicated and real like this. So even though they've been growing more rapidly than the rest of the Western world, they haven't taken it over.
Well, it's a start.
We have to look at sweeping reform, the paradigm shift. Let's bring in some climate conversation in this part of the conversation. And Steve, as we ease into that part of the conversation, I'm curious if there's any parallels you see from 1920 and the spending boom that happened after, in the 20s with how we're emerging out of the pandemic. Are you seeing any parallels to that?
Actually, yeah. I mean, I'm a fan of the Stephen Colbert show, which, I can't watch as easily as I could in America, obviously. But I watched it when he had his first live performance. Did you see that?
No.
Have a look on YouTube and watch it. They had a dancing vaccines came out on stage and joined him and so on. And everybody was happy. The only people who got inside the theater were double vaccinated. And they were hugging and dancing and, clapping, yada, yada, yada. And I've seen people say that maybe the euphoria of the 1920s was in response to getting away from the Spanish flu and the First World War, but actually more immediately the Spanish flu that hit people more directly, and more people died in it than died in the First World War. The liberation, the sense it was over, is a large part of why the party mentality of the 20s began. But we're not going to have long to party with climate change. Yeah. Those parties, quite literally, those parties are going to get washed away and burnt out.
Yeah, Andrew, what's your position on climate change? How are you coming to terms with it, thinking about it? I
don't really worry about it. One easy kind of rhetorical thing is when they say like rising sea levels and all that stuff is if you have ice cubes in your glass and the water's at the very top, when those ice cubes melt, the water doesn't overflow. So I don't think we have to really worry about that. On top of that, God never said he wasn't going to flood the earth again. And so I think a lot of this is people want to worry about something so big that they don't actually have to worry about the immediate things around their life. And two, governments just love some big dangerous thing so that they can centralize power control and stuff like that. So that's how I see it. I seem like I'm in the minority on this one in this call.
Yes, you
but
are,
that's
and
fine.
you're wrong, by the way. You are fundamentally, categorically, unequivocally wrong.
All right.
Yeah, okay. Have you heard what's called the second law of thermodynamics?
Yes, I'm an engineer.
Great. Okay. Even that should let you realize why ultimately that argument doesn't work, because there's a wonderful blog post you should take a look called Finite Physicist Meets Exponential Economist. And this physicist explained his conversation he had with an economist over dinner one day. Beautiful blog post. And he gave the example, if the economy grows at 2.3% per annum, and he used that because 2.3% per annum, if you compound it, gives you a factor of 10 increase per century. Just by the second law of thermodynamics, in 450 years, the temperature level of the planet would be 100 degrees Celsius.
But that assumes exponential growth.
Yes, of course it does. In other words, it assumes what people take for granted.
Sure, I get it. But I also, I get we take exponential growth for granted, but that isn't actually how it works, right?
No, it is how it works. When you take a look over time, if you the simplest way to fit, I mean, of course, there are huge declines, but if you wanted to fit what's happened from 1800 to 2100, the only function that's going to fit it for you is going to be an exponential. That applies to energy consumption as well as to GDP, and they're correlated like Siamese twins. So in this sense, if you are, and I'm glad you're an engineer, because I've had far more respect for engineers than I have for economists, then when you do the math, and that's what the blog is called, by the way, do the math, since we've managed, if like a 2.3% per annum rate of growth is low compared to what the World Bank thinks. The World Bank wants to average 3%. That's what's called Okun's law, is that a 3% rate of real economic growth is sufficient to keep unemployment from rising, because you have about 1% population growth and 1.5%, 2% technical change. Then you want about a 3% rate of growth to have not have rising unemployment. Now, if you factor that in and look at where we've gone, we're starting to taper finally in population. So you've got a sigmoidal effect applying there. But fundamentally, a 2.3% rate of growth would be seen as low by economists today, a failure. And this guy points out that if you maintain that failure for 450 to 500 years, you'd reach a point where the temperature of the surface, just due to simple old energy entropy, would exceed the boiling point of water. So there has to be, even in that sense alone, there has to be limits to growth. Now, when you take it further back and say, what about the impact of us dumping the waste we generate into the biosphere, then that brings you dramatically forward, because we know that carbon, we've known since, you know how to do a Fourier transform?
It's been a while, but...
It's been a while, okay, but you know who I'm talking about. Okay, Fourier was one of the first people to point out carbon dioxide's role in causing the temperature of the planet, okay? So I've known it since Fourier. Now, rising carbon dioxide causes rising energy retention of the sun's rays. It's not what we're putting into the atmosphere, is what we're leaving behind from the sun. So if we keep it up, we're going to hit 3 and 4 and 5 degree temperature increases. Now, people make the mistake, and I presume you're making the same mistake, of saying, oh, well, you know, I'll wear one less sweater. That's literally what I heard an English economist say back in the 80s about it. That increasing the temperature of the biosphere by that much completely changes the chemical and biological processes that can occur in the biosphere. And if we allow that to happen, we're extinct. Now, I think you're making a huge mistake to dismiss that, because the first warnings of it came from the limits to growth back in 1972. And the people who wrote the limits to growth were MIT engineers, by the way, not airy-fairy, you know, libertarian or, you know, communist, whatever. They were MIT engineers. And they said, if we factor in what's happened from 1900 and 1970, get ourselves a set of 7 indicators, which we project forward, so we make our model fit from 1900 to 1970, and then run it forward with these 7 to 9 indicators and see what happens. They predicted the sort of experiences we're going through right now in 2020. Not the exact ones, obviously, but the timing, which they made deliberately vague. When you look at when they see the peak of energy production, pollution, and population, it was between 2020 and 2050, roughly speaking. And that's what we're going through right now. So I think I would suggest you pay a bit more attention to it.
Yeah, but they've been saying that we're going to hit peak oil every 10 years. They've been saying we're going to hit peak temperature every 10 years, and it never seems to happen.
No, they haven't. This is the caricature that people use to dismiss this whole idea. When you, like, for example, I see people saying, I mean, for example, one of my favorite assholes on the planet is an economist called Richard Toll. And this jerk and I were having a debate on Twitter. And he started saying how the limits to growth made all these predictions about running out of molybdenum and beryllium, blah, 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 blah. And I finally wrote to him, tell you what, Richard, I'll get Randers, who's a personal friend, one of the authors of the limits to growth, is now a friend of mine. I'll get Randers to apologise for quoting a table by the Department of Mines of the USA, okay, if you'll apologise for assuming that a roof will protect you from climate change. So what you were taking up is saying this is what the predictions made. That particular table in the limits to growth was a quoted table by the Department of Mines, and they simply reproduced it to show what a simplistic level of thinking about resources would imply. That wasn't at all their model. So when people come up with comments like that, they've been making this run out and that'll make out, it is a distortion of the original research. And having watched economists distort research for 50 or 60 years, I don't let anybody get away with that anymore.
Yeah, but I mean, I've seen, it's been a while since I've looked at this topic, but, you know, climate people distort the research as much as possible. Like the whole, I mean, all the alarmists are where polar bears are all dying. They're at the highest numbers they've ever been. The ice caps are melting. They're the thickest they've ever been. All these indicators,
You're talking denialist talking points. I'm reading the economic literature.
Okay.
You know, one of the disadvantages of the way we divide the world up is that academic papers are available to academics, and what you get into the public domain isn't necessarily that particular research. I'm sorry, you're talking denialist talking points, not real data.
All right. Well, agree to disagree, I guess.
Do some actual research. I'll send you some papers if you like afterwards. But
yeah, and you guys, let me maybe kind of bring it in because we're approaching the end of the show. I certainly didn't realize that we were gonna go there. I hope it was some lively discussion. Thank you, Steve, for bringing up that very quick and decisive information. That was, for me, very worthwhile, and I think for people watching, it'll also be worthwhile. Andrew, I hope you felt that there was some value in some of those comments. And also, I hope that you enjoyed the opportunity to, ask Steve the questions that you asked him. And, I want to thank everybody for joining our show. If there's anything else you guys want to say to each other, go ahead.
For being a bit heavy there, Andrew, but I'm working with economists right now who are doing similar denialism to what you're talking about, and it offends me, it outrages me that they get away with it. People falling for this stuff is one thing. So on my main attack is directed at people like William Nordhaus and Richard Toll and all the economists who produce absolute garbage on climate change, such as, for example, and you won't be aware of this, assuming that 87% of industry will be unaffected by climate change because it happens indoors. So, the really bad stuff, the really stupid research is done by people saying climate change is not a problem. When you look at what the scientists are doing, the data is extremely powerful and unequivocal. And it's easy to be conned by the economists. I'm afraid that's one of the sources you let yourself be conned by on that one. So, do a bit more reading elsewhere.
Well, regardless of the climate thing, talking about the economy and stuff like that, I don't usually get to talk in depth about these kind of things and with people so knowledgeable. And I definitely didn't think when I did a review of this Debunking Economics book that I get to talk with the author. So it's been a real pleasure. And thank you for inviting me on.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Andrew. We really appreciate it. Bye now.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.